Hi everyone, I'm Ellen Abramowitz. Welcome to MoCA. I'm the president of the museum, and we're very proud tonight to be welcoming the guest here tonight, which I will let the author of the book Inside Pee-wee's Playhouse introduce, Cassim Gaines. He will be here tonight after our talk to be signing the book, and I wanted to also let you know that we are incredibly proud to be celebrating the 25th anniversary of the debut of Pee-wee's Playhouse. I'm sure you all know that Pee-wee's debut was in 1986 through 1991. I see a lot of smiling faces here, and we're so fortunate to have some of the artists here that participated in that. So please stay, enjoy, and
thank you guys for coming out on this rainy night to come out and celebrate 25 years of Pee-wee's Playhouse and Pee-wee's Playhouse animation. I have with us today Robert Lyons. Rob has directed animation for Pee-wee's Playhouse. He's the owner and director of Interface Arts and remains the only person to have ever received a bachelor's degree in experimental film animation from SUNY College at New Paltz. So Robert, thank you for joining. In the middle we have Steve Oakes. Steve Oakes was supervising producer and creative director of Pee-wee's Playhouse. His demented mind, by his own admission, was behind the original MTV animated logo treatments that are among the classics that are still played today. He is currently president of Curious Pictures, a mixed media animation studio based in Manhattan. Steve, thank you very much. And to my right is Timothy Young. Timothy served as an animator during the first season of Pee-wee's Playhouse. He's the author and illustrator of the award-winning children's book, I'm Looking for a Monster, and I believe you have some copies of that afterwards. If anyone's interested, come up and see Tim, and he'll have copies of his book. Tim, thank you. So I wanted to begin with going and taking a look at the opening of Pee-wee's Playhouse, which has a ton of animation, the puppets, we're going to talk about all of that, but I wanted to set the stage and go back in time a little bit. So, Steve, can you talk a little bit about how the deal for Pee-wee's Playhouse ended up getting brokered and about that animated sequence that we just saw?
Well, the opening is actually a pretty good indication of the inspiration for the whole team at the production company here in New York. Broadcast Arts was the name of the company. And we actually rented a loft just several blocks south of here for the live action, where we built the stage and fabricated and performed all the puppets. And the animation studio was up in Broadway and Bleecker. So it was definitely a local downtown production, and it really embraced a lot of artists and the creative community that was a little bit new to me, because I had just moved to New York in 1985. And Broadcast Arts, the studio that produced the first season, had launched with a lot of work from MTV, which was just on the satellite. People really were just getting to embrace the whole music video phenomena, and a lot of animation and special effects and sort of mixed media were being embraced with a lot of music videos and the on-air look for MTV. Their slogan at the time was, "We're always the same by always being different," and the logo was, still is, the big fat M with the squiggle TV. And we had the pleasure of cranking out those little 10-second animated logos in batches of 10, and made 50 to 100 of them in a couple years of the beginning. And that got the attention of a lot of advertising agencies and the TV networks. And we went to CBS in 1985, late 1985, pitched a bunch of crazy ideas, and we're very excited about, we should have our own TV show. And they said, yeah, but we have an idea that we'd like to work with Paul Rubens and do a Pee-wee Saturday morning show, but there's lots of problems, and maybe you can help us solve them. The problems were that Paul was a rising star with his first movie, and was very busy with his career, and you probably know a lot of his early comedy was, while it was making fun of this child, or this children's entertainment actor, it was very adult-oriented. It started, the adult comedy circuit, and then the HBO special, and he had mirrors on his shoes that he could put underneath Miss Yvonne's skirt, and have a good look. So it needed some translation for Saturday morning, and he wasn't so sure that he wanted to take his career into the world of children's television. So the nice thing about what our creative group in New York had to offer was we could really do an animation show, and Pee-wee, the character, could be the host and could kind of interject as introducing the animated segments, and he would not have to make a huge commitment in time to the show. But when things got started, it became too much fun, and there was so much energy with so many artists, and these weren't just commercial artists being hired to do specific tasks. These were inspirational artists like Gary Panter and a lot of other, the Aardman animation team, Peter Lord and Nick and Golly, and they came over and introduced a huge stop motion component, and it was a wonderful alumni now that came together in a really unique time, and it was exciting. It was very sort of outsider production. We didn't use a professional studio. We rented a loft above a garment fabric store. Didn't have proper air conditioning, so we had to rent a air conditioning truck from out at Newark Airport that came in with a giant tube that normally would be inserted into airplanes when their engines were down to cool off the interior. And it was literally in the alley, snaked up into one of the windows over the set and pointed at Paul to keep him cool because he sweated profusely. But while he was doing his live action bit, there was this guerrilla army of little units doing the dinosaur family in stop motion, and the ant farm, which was little cutouts of paper doing the little ant farm, and there was the section for Life in the Fridge, yes, and the penny cartoons, which were so inspirational, and the mutant toys. Right, we never got those produced for Toys R Us, but it was still quite. We had a shelf with all the mutant toys on display in the lobby of the studio, so it was a fun tour, and I have many fond memories.
I have a picture up right now of Gary Panter. Gary Panter is an underground artist based in Brooklyn, I believe. And what he's holding right now is a vinyl record that he designed for the 1981 Pee Wee Herman show soundtrack that ran at the Groundlings and the Roxy Theater in Los Angeles. I want to go through and take a look at some of Gary's sketches for the designs for the show. He served as production designer. This is a puppet, Monsieur Le Croc, which was not in the CBS show, but was in the original Pee Wee Herman show. This is a character, Mr. Mouse, that existed. And again, these are Gary Panter's sketches. Here you can see, if you're familiar with the original HBO show, you can see Gary's sketch for the puppet body for Pee Wee Herman to fly at the end. He gets his wish to fly. Anyone recognize this one? Terry the pterodactyl. And you can see the all the detail of Gary Panter's style with the technical specifications that he indicated. If I have a quote here from Ed Bark of the Dallas Morning News from a year ago today, believe it or not, 25 years ago today, who said that Pee Wee's Playhouse may appeal to preschoolers, but it can more accurately be described as an adult cartoon. Rob, I was just wondering if you can either agree or disagree. Do you think Pee Wee Herman's Playhouse was more an adult cartoon?
I think it functioned as both. I think it was chock full of double entendres, in the same sort of vein as maybe some of the old Warner Brothers cartoons used to be, or even some of the Fleischer Studio, Betty Boop type stuff. It was meant to appeal to both audiences simultaneously, so that there would be things in there that anybody of a young mind would easily understand and appreciate and be able to laugh at and enjoy. But at the same time, embedded within that was a whole variety of humor that operated on a different level. That as an adult, you would get it, but it didn't quite cross the line where it could be maybe deemed offensive, let's say, to corrupt young minds. So we would watch these things after they were completed every week and have kind of a party, and we would be just laughing and rolling, and it was always so much fun because you'd go like, oh man, I can't believe this, because you know what it meant, but at the same time you knew that it could easily go by because it was not quite crossing that line.
And Rob, I'm going to ask you to hold on to the microphone because I have a penny cartoon to show that you worked on. I'm going to ask you to talk about it after we see it, okay? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Penny. Well, see, there's these bunch of boys. And they get their attention by, giggling and laughing. I think they're much more than girls. I think they maturity slower than girls. I was pointing out 3. He's really like weird. He's 10 now, and he's really a little weird, and I don't want to be in his class again. You know, because he can drive me crazy. He cries if he loses in his game. He cries. And he says, Mom, she's 270 something. Alan, nobody's IQ is 200 and something. And he tries to kill himself. One day he tries to kill himself because he got pushed out of the game. This boy's crazy. He has a crush on me, and he has a crush on me.
Okay, well, a bunch of things about those. First of all, I didn't have that big a role in that. There was, I believe, 4 different animators all in all involved, one of which was David Daniels, another was, I believe, was Bill Wright. I did a small part of it, basically because I think the animator who was scheduled to work on it that day called in sick, and I had already pretty much taken care of my responsibilities on the set of Life in the Fridge, which was my primary responsibility. I was the director of photography for Life in the Fridge. And I was like, I begged the producer, I said, please let me animate some of this. So I got in it and got to be part of it. It was really a lot of fun. Something of interest that you should all know, 2 of the boys in the foreground of that particular cartoon were actually the 2 owners of the studio at the time. This young one. I forgot.
And I have to say, I'm the culprit who decided to do that. I had already put Nick Park and Gully into another episode. And I thought, well, I gotta make some boys. Who should they be?
Bad boys.
Just on a technical note, for people who might be interested in that sort of thing, it's an unusual form of stop-motion animation that was brought over to us from Aardman Animation in England. I had never seen it done this way before. I had done clay animation in the past where you sculpted 3-dimensional figures and had them walk around in sets and so on. But what they were doing was a different variety of clay animation. Instead of having a camera looking horizontally at a tabletop, they had a camera mounted overhead looking down at a plane of clear glass, and they were sculpting the figures in sort of half round, so in low relief. And there would be another level of glass beneath that where a background could be placed. And it was a very economic way of producing stop-motion animation in clay that didn't use nearly the same amount of materials. It could be executed much more quickly. And
Gravity was your friend.
gravity worked for you instead of against you. On a personal note, this was the first time in my life I had ever tried to do lip sync animation, which I found to be really hard. I give people who've done it a lot of credit for doing it as often and fast as they managed to do it. I was constantly oscillating between trying to act through the character and check the animation sheets to see what shape the mouth was supposed to be at that particular moment in time and make sure that it was correct so that it would look like the character was saying what it was supposed to be saying.
One of the other interesting things about the Penny cartoon was it was not scripted. Maybe you know this, but we had 2 young girls who, I think they were between 6 and 8, and they were brought into a recording studio, and they were asked simple questions. What did you do today? Who's your best friend? And they just had verbal diarrhea and would talk and go on these sort of hallucinations. And we tried to make sense of it, and who cares if it didn't make sense? And then we edit them down. Maybe a 20-minute interview would become a 1-minute audio clip. And then the fun part was to animate it. And sometimes you would literally animate what was being said, and other times you would do sort of a surprise counterpoint that was sort of an unexpected misinterpretation of what was being said. So it was wonderfully imaginative, and the source sort of came from the spirit of the youthful Penny character, as opposed to some writer smoking cigarettes late at night on the computer.
And actually, Tim has a special guest with us here today. Most of you most likely do not know this, but Matchbox Toys at a point in time commissioned for a penny doll to be released. It was never actually released, but Tim sculpted the doll, and Tim's going to talk a little bit about sculpting an animated character, or making a doll out of an animated character.
After having worked on the first season of shows and having sculpted Penny hundreds of times in plasticine, I met a woman named Karen Lyons who she hadn't had anything to do with the show, but she had worked for Matchbox Toys making the Pee-wee doll and actually she had done the Terry the Pterodactyl and Cherry dolls for Matchbox. And we had lunch and I gave her a tour of the studios and she was really excited. And I expressed an interest in working on toys myself. And she said, well, I'll tell the people over at Matchbox, that you did the penny dolls, the penny sculptures. And she did, and they contacted me, and I got my first job designing a toy. I got to do the control drawings for the doll. I sculpted the heads. They had a plush designer make the body. I gave them a whole list of phrases that they could use for the doll. Was really involved in the project. And they produced the vinyl version. This is a resin casting of the original, which I had never done a toy before, so I didn't know how it was really done. I started sculpting it in Sculpey, which is a polymer clay, and cleaned that up and sanded it forever and made it really nice and smooth, only to bring it in to Matchbox to be told, oh, we need it in wax. Okay, so I made a silicone mold of it and made a wax version and cleaned that up and brought that back, and they were very, very happy. And then that wax goes off to China, where they make the metal molds to do cavity mold, rotational vinyl heads. So they got this whole thing done. They produced a number of prototypes. This is one of the prototypes, and then showed it at Toy Fair, where the marketing people and the buyers all said, well, Penny never interacts with anyone else on the show, so I don't think anyone's going to want that toy. So they dropped it from the line. They never actually produced it or sold it in stores. So once again, the marketing guys got it wrong.
Thanks. It's impossible to talk about the Penny cartoons without talking about Nick Park and the art guys from England. Steve, can you talk a little bit about how Nick Park became involved with Huey's Playhouse?
Sure. Before Broadcast Arts moved to New York, we started in Washington, D.C. I had met Peter Lord after seeing some of his work and invited him to visit Washington, and for a while we considered joining forces, and he was going to move his team, which was Nick Golly and David Spockstrom, who was more of the cinematographer of the group, to Washington, and it almost came to happen, but they sort of chickened out from moving their families, and it was a big deal, and so we didn't do that. But then when we moved to New York and this thing happened, and it was an all hands on deck kind of situation, and everybody was calling everybody who knew anybody, and artists were showing up with portfolios, and it was very exciting to review things and basically say, okay, can you start tomorrow? And a wonderful large group of artists really piled on this project. And I called Peter Lord in Bristol, England, and said, we're going to do a lot of clay animation. Can you put together a SWAT team and come to New York for like 6-8 months? And sure enough, Nick and Dolly were his two animators that were part of his stable, and they had already had some experience doing this sort of interesting style of live audio. They had been commissioned by, I think, the BBC to do a series of little mini documentaries where they would go into the countryside and interview citizens in anything from an old folks home to a kitchen, and take found audio and then create these little figurines and animate them with the with dialogue that you couldn't write because there was these stammerings and these little non sequiturs, and and just idiosyncrasies that just had so much character. And we took that template for Penny and did some casting and found these two little girls. But they had a great time. They just inserted themselves into the production. They had their own little production line, and then got to go home and become rich and famous.
For those of you that are unfamiliar, Nick Park is an Academy Award nominated animator, creator.
Three times.
Three? I'm so sorry. 3-time winner. I'm so sorry. I'll fix that in editing. And creator of Wallace and Gromit. And I had the pleasure last week, or a couple weeks ago, of speaking with Nick Park and Golly, who wanted so desperately to be here but couldn't get here because of commitments. So we did videotape an interview, and we have an excerpt of that Mocha exclusive for you today. First, I wanted to thank you guys so much
Nick Park on the
for
left.
taking some time out of your schedule to talk about your contributions to Huey's Playhouse and to help Mocha, the Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art, with our look back at the animation of Huey's Playhouse. I'm not sure if you realize, but Huey's Playhouse actually debuted 25 years ago today, so it's been quite some time.
Oh, wow, really? Yeah. Right.
I wanted to know, what was the process like, or what is the process like of animating for hire, doing something, creating a character that someone else created versus doing the Wallace and Gromit stuff or the other characters that you create?
Well, sorry, where to start?
Well, it was quite early in our careers. We hadn't really, I hadn't personally done a great deal of animation. I've done a lot of model making and bits of animation in commercials, so it was a big, I've been thrown in the deep end for me. But yes, it wasn't unusual because for me it was like the process of making a TV commercial. Somebody says we want this, and we had to work out how to do it. Really.
Yeah, and I guess we were kind of known at the time at Aardman for doing stuff with kind of pre-recorded voices, often using ordinary members of, non-actors, no script. So we kind of set off in that, we had some pedigree in that direction, and sorry.
I think we were asked to develop it because I think they weren't sure what to do with us or how to achieve the penny cartoon. So the only idea was they'd have a penny cartoon, but I don't think they knew what the content was going to be, or producers didn't know what it was going to be. So we offered a suggestion to record lots of little New York girls talking about various subjects, and we could edit the track together to create a kind of surreal story.
Yeah, we were sent some designs in the first place but we weren't sure how to interpret those in clay. So we decided to. I was developing Wallace and Gromit at the time, so Penny kind of automatically got this kind of Wallace kind of style mouth. But the rest was we were just given the brief. We had to do 12 minutes in 12 weeks, and so we invented the technique also that by which we could do that, to make it doable within. So there was no elaborate set building. It was all pure clay, using layers of glass, almost like a multi-plane camera, really. So that we could just move things around on glass in a kind of semi-relief form.
So it's a technique we kind of used on Penny that we used many years later in art because it was it's very economical and quick. It took gravity away, which is always the difficult thing for stock frame methods.
How to get a minute a week done. That's a lot in animation terms. That's a heck of a lot, and so that's why we created this. We had like a rostrum camera, a 35mm film camera, looking down on about 2 or 3 layers of glass.
Yeah.
So that we could lay the characters on the glass, and this was also that we could just be working in front of the camera as much of the time as possible. No technique, not a lot of preparation or set building. And we just come over freshly from the UK. We just made a video for Peter Gabriel, the Sledgehammer video. So we were kind of looked up to in a way, and we were kind of left to get on with it as a kind of independent unit.
And were you used to animating actual objects, like the pennies that are there for her eyes, is it easy to incorporate actual objects with the claymation?
Yeah, I think it was fine. It dictated the size. So you've got 2 pennies, and then the penny was built around those 2 pennies. But the trouble is, we had to change the scale sometimes, so we had to have small pennies made. Yeah, that was relatively easy.
Yeah, that was a kind of a restraint given to us, really. That was the only thing that stayed, really, was that she had to have pennies behind. And we just put black blobs of clay on, like the pupils, and just moved them around on pennies.
I think that was Paul's idea.
Yeah, I think the technique was pretty quick to do, really. In fact, to save building sets, we just went out and got some kind of gift wrap paper and put it in as the wallpaper behind, and sometimes that would wipe the frame or move.
Yeah, it was always economy in mind, because it was, we had to shoot so much a week.
When you think back on those penny segments, how do they fit in the world of things that art does? Do you see a lot of connections between those segments or the technique that you used in animating those segments and what you do with the other art and stuff?
Well, personally, I took that technique on further, and I wrote and directed 2 series of called Rex the Runt, where I used that same technique because it was very economical. Used several sheets of glass, and we've used it a lot of times since in claymation. It's been very useful over the years.
Especially back in the days when the only way you could hide, if a character leapt through the air, and Golly was talking about gravity being a problem. If a character leaps through the air, normally we would have to suspend it on wires or fishing line and they would reflect. And before the days when you could just digitally paint them out, so the glass was a great alternative to that.
Yeah.
As you say, Golly took the technique a lot further. It's fantastic. Hit to see it, Rex the Runt.
In terms of mapping out the story and storyboarding, how essential is storyboarding to stop motion animation in general and the penny sequences in specific?
Well, it's very crucial to what we do now. I think in those days we kind of came over to America as a cottage industry, so we only saw storyboards as being useful for us. So we could kind of plan out the thing. We kind of realised that actually other people were building stuff. So both Nick and I would draw kind of bits of set or characters for people to make them plasticine. So all of the design and the storyboarding was all kind of mixed up in the same process, which these days it isn't for us. It's much more professional. But I see that stuff all the way through.
Yeah, because our stories were kind of dictated to by the interviews that were done with the little girls who like 10-year-olds who they just talked off the top of their heads about all kinds of stuff, and we just used whatever they talked about. We used it as a guide, and so like I say, it wasn't very structured, and they kind of just let us get on with it to a great degree.
Do you find that liberating to kind of animate without a formal script, without something that you've written or that someone has written specifically for animating, or do you find it kind of intimidating to have to rely on all those New York girls going off on tangents and such?
I find it exciting, really. So tell you about
No, that's absolutely right. I found it very liberating, and it's very exciting. Because what you're doing is basically subverting what they say. You're finding a funny visual take on a line, So it was great fun, really good fun, and in the sort of tradition of what Armour did before and since, in shows like Creature Comforts.
I think it's because animation, by definition, is very planned, and contrived, and very set and stuff. And I love storyboarding for 15 fictional, stories. As Guy says, it's almost like it's a kind of cross between animation and documentary making, where you have to go with the material that you've got to work with, and subverting it, like you say, someone, Penny might say one thing, so we interpret it another way, and we just have fun with that.
All right, well, thank you so much, Nick and Dolly. I really appreciate you guys taking some time out to chat with me about your recollections of working on Huey's Playhouse and your thoughts about stop motion animation.
Okay, so see you.
Thanks, Cassie.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Yeah,
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks for clapping. We're videotaping for them so we can send it over. I have a quote from Trey Parker of South Park infamy. Trey Parker says regarding South Park, "We knew right after the pilot that going completely with stop motion would be impossible. It took us 3 months to do the pilot using construction paper cutouts. We'd be making a show a year, basically. I think computer animation makes for a better show." Is there a place in 2011 and beyond for traditional stop motion animation, or is the best thing to do to move to computer animation? Whoever wants to field it.
Well, I have a strong opinion about that. Me too. There is always going to be room for the humanity of handmade art and hand-manipulated material, but thank goodness for computer assistance in streamlining the process and giving the artist the freedom to move forward in a kind of a expeditious way. So making models and putting pigment on surfaces and mushing things around, that sort of mixed media connection to the real world is fantastic, and people appreciate it. You can go to great lengths with computer animation to fool you to think that it was handmade, but there is always, or in the majority of the cases, the just doing it generates a surface or a reality or an interaction with light that you just appreciate. And then you can go back and manipulate it and polish it or take things out of context or manipulate time wonderfully with digital technology. So I think it's not a this or that. It's you really want to be that sort of Mission Impossible designer and choose the right tool for the right part of making animation or anything else in the motion picture realm come to life, in my opinion.
From the perspective of someone who's involved himself in special effects, primarily in the photographic process, one thing that you'll hear consistently, if you are like fond of looking at the extra features on DVDs, for instance, is that these artists will always say that they want to capture as much as they possibly can in reality in front of the camera, and then rely on the other tools, the digital tools, to enhance or to alter that to create the final product. From the point of view of an artist, of somebody who spends a lot of their time doing this sort of thing, from a process point of view, I would much rather spend my time painting things, sculpting things, sawing up boards, working in a wood shop, a machine shop, working on a stage, moving around lights and cameras, than sitting all day in front of a computer, if I had the choice to do one or the other. But on the other hand, from some of the things that Steve said, I absolutely am enamored with the possibilities that are now available to monitor what I'm doing as I go, which I could not do at the time of Pee-wee's Playhouse, for instance. When we were shooting 35mm film, we had no way of seeing frame by frame what we were doing until we were completely finished with a shot or the whole day's work and sent it to a film lab who would develop and print the film and get it back and put it on a moviola the next day, which was a device for screening the film, and look at it. And if there was something wrong, we had to go redo that shot completely.
If a light
from
burned
scratch.
out.
Yeah, somebody kicked the light, somebody left a pencil in the middle of the set. It could have been anything.
Or the
But,
bottlenecks.
so that ability to see it frame by frame as you go and sort of monitor the process and know that the product that you're producing as you're producing it is in fact exactly what you expect it to be is a huge time saver and can help you as an artist improve your ability to make that art. But in terms of like one or the other, it's definitely not one or the other. And I think from the viewer's point of view, from the people who consume this as product, who look at it, there's an inherent magic about seeing a real object, like a child's toy or some clay or a puppet, come to life. This real thing in an actual space lit with real light, that has a magic to it that I think is never going to be entirely duplicated by something that's completely created in a sort of virtual domain. So I think there will always be a place for it. And testament to it is the fact that people like Nick Park and Aardman Animation garnered 3 Academy Awards for their stop-motion animation work, and all of them came within the age of this new digital technology. So there's still a place for this. People love that sort of thing. Granted, it's hard to compete in terms of just the economics of production, but I don't think it's going anywhere. It's going to be with us for a long time to come. At least I hope so, because I want to continue doing it.
As someone who's moved into the computer realm myself, I do a lot of my illustration work in the computer. I draw my designs first and scan them in and then do a lot of rendering in the computer. I just find it to be another tool like a pencil or a lump of clay to get my ideas out there. But I think you're absolutely right that there's always going to be some kid who's going to discover that they can manipulate clay, and the nice thing now is you don't really need to have a lot of setup to start getting into this. You can use the camera that's on your laptop to film. My son is doing this now, doing little clay animations and getting them right onto the screen and having the satisfaction of not having to send film out to a lab, or taking it down to the drugstore with your little 8mm stock. So there are opportunities for kids now to discover things that took a lot more money than we had as kids to learn.
It's much more accessible now. I think a whole new generation of people can actually explore this art form and see the results of it immediately, right off their laptop computer. As you said, using the webcam that's attached to it with basic, inexpensive software. Almost anybody has a computer nowadays, whereas it was the fortunate few who had a Super 8 camera, perhaps, that they could borrow from their parents as a kid and shoot something, when they were back in the 70s or something like that.
I want to go through and take a look at some other, we mentioned storyboards. These are some storyboards of Phil Trumbo, who was an animation director, and Ken Burton, who's an animator, working on the Dinosaur Family. Here is some of Wayne White's, who was another artistic director on the show, working on sketches for Life in the Fridge. And I have a Life in the Fridge clip to show you, and then Rob, I'm going to ask you to comment.
Morpheus, everybody.
Yep.
I have a question if you want a question.
Yes,
You just want to
shoot
go.
with the question.
Well, the first thing that strikes me, and I looked at a couple different Life in the Fridge clips, and they're all really brief. The penny cartoons go on for about a minute or so. The Dinosaur Family goes on for about a minute or so. I was just curious as to the difficulty in terms of shooting life in the fridge? Was it, because there's a lot of jumping around and gravity we heard was an issue before?
Yeah, it's traditional stop motion, so the characters are bound by gravity, they have to appear to be freestanding, and because they're happening in a recognizable environment of a refrigerator, that did involve certain constraints, because we literally had to build a set that looked like a refrigerator, and it has walls that are pretty close together in the back and the top and everything else, which was a big challenge lighting-wise. But you know, they were relatively short segments. I think a lot of the stop motion were relatively short, including, you know, Newton Toys and Dinosaur Family as well. There's a lot of characters, so that also, you know, was a factor. We only had one full-time animator, a gentleman by the name of Spencer Cook, did a phenomenal job. He also animated Terry the Pterodactyl, sometimes when it wasn't a puppet. And that particular clip, aside from, you know, the fact that we have Lawrence Fishburne as a cowboy, which is quite amazing in and of itself.
We know what they say, big boots, big feet. Or big feet, big boots.
That was one of the episodes that I actually did get to animate a little bit of, and I did, although it wasn't in the storyboard, subject to the director, Rob Niosi, that why don't we do a little bow tie spin shot. And that was based on another clay animation friend of mine who was an Academy Award winner as well, Brooklyn native Jimmy Pickard, who had done Sunday in New York, and he had a shot with a spinning bow tie, and when he received his Academy Award, he rigged up a little motor. So he had like 3 seconds of fame on camera at the Academy Awards, and he made his bow tie spin. I, yeah, we got to do that. And we did, and I was real happy about that. And that's a very famous Pee-wee dance, that tiptoe dance. So
I've seen that.
Tequila dance.
And we in the model shop had to make a unique set of shoes for each of the characters to wear. Large platform shoes for little ice cubes.
Which were exactly the size of real ice cubes.
This is a great point to talk about Paul Reubens and his influence on the animation of Pee-wee's Playhouse. You mentioned kind of that Paul would be on the set and the animators would be hard at work. What was Paul's role in the animation? Did he contribute story ideas, or the scripts come from him?
Well, a lot of the, as we've been talking about, a lot of the animation was not scripted. It's more pantomime and sort of slapstick situation. So the animators would storyboard their concepts, for the most part, independent of writers. And they would get shown to Paul before committed. But Paul was pretty much enamored with the different animation segments being done in this style. The only segment that he really obsessed about was the opening with Phil Trumbo. And I think you document that in your book, where it was months of arduous tests and preparation before he signed off on it. It was really one of the things that he fixated on. But the penny cartoons, the dinosaurs inside the fridge, they were all such wonderful little vignettes with little squeaky voices and sound effects and sound design that, and that was how the show was originally envisioned, is that he would just sort of be a host who kind of bopped from one place to another, but then he really enjoyed his screen time, so he sort of took more airtime, and the animation bits did get a little bit shorter.
To piggyback on Steve's comment, for those unfamiliar, the opening was actually approved about 10 days before the show went up on the air. And Phil Trumbo, who was the animation director, got the approval, and Paul said, I bet you never thought I'd sign off on that. And Phil said, you had to sign off on it, otherwise we'd start the show with no opening. The show opens next week. So yeah, it was a long, very long process. I do have some more sketches and their real-life counterparts to show you. Again, it's really important to think about the fact that everyone that worked as production designers on this show really were artists and are artists. This is another Wayne White sketch for Billy Baloney, and Billy Baloney debuted in season 2, and it looks identical. Randy, this guy. This is the remodeled Randy, the new Randy. A number of conceptual sketches for Mr. Kite and his final form, and that's Wayne White, the puppeteer and production designer and artist operating the Puppet Land Band, Dirty Dog, Cool Cat, Chicky Baby. I wanted to just talk very briefly about the Connect the Dots sequence, because that's a fan favorite. Why do you think the Connect the Dots sequence really sticks out in people's minds in terms of being a moment that people really remember from the series?
Well, it has a nostalgic connection to really early children's television and activities. But in a funny way, it's actually one of my least favorite pieces because it's a technique that was just becoming available, the whole digital vector-based, there's a paint box and a kaleidoscope or something like that. Yeah, it was early technology for computer animation, and therefore, in my opinion, it looks the most dated. The puppets and the stop motion, that's still something that has a certain integrity, and yet the crude computer animation has been so leapfrogged with capability. I mean, anyone with a Flash animation program could outdo that, on their laptop in an afternoon. It was wonderful that we embraced the new digital computer animation, and the magic screen was a fun sort of interface for including that. But as I say, I think that's the one thing that didn't age as well.
Well, we'll see.
Hey, Phoebe, guess what? It's time to play with me. Oh boy, you're me!
It's more about Paul's character.
Song, yeah.
It's a spaceship! Look, there's the moon! Penny's coming! I lost my space bag!
Threw it out.
International direction. There's a planet! Ah! It's the planet of the giants! Better get out of here! Ah! I'm going right back to the Playhouse. Meet me there.
Tim, we've spoken before about some of the other animated shows you've worked on. What strikes me about that clip is, and Pee-wee's Playhouse in general, is the blending of live action and animation in the same frame. Can you talk a little bit about how the way Pee-wee's Playhouse used animation and the effect it's had on people in comparison to maybe some of the other animated shows you've worked on?
Well, I think, speaking as someone who came into the world of animation on that show, that was my first experience out of college. I'd always loved animation, always wanted to do something with it, but I really didn't know how, and getting a chance to build all these models and work on all these different things. I ended up, and I was just saying to Steve earlier, I came into getting the job on Pee-wee's Playhouse without even realizing I was getting a job in Pee-wee's Playhouse. And I came in with a box of sculptures, and Prudence Fenton, the producer who interviewed me, said, "Great, when can you start? And go over there. We're gonna, we need you to work on this stuff." And I ended up working from almost the beginning of the show to when the show was already airing and we were adding little bits of animation that were kind of filler into it. And to see all of these different techniques in one place, I don't think any show had ever done everything from cardboard cutouts to embracing, as we just said, computer animation. So I think it led to a lot of other animation projects. There were after that, a lot of shows that came along, and especially in New York in the late 80s and early 90s, there were a lot of production studios. There was Jumbo Pictures did Doug, and Peter Wallach Studios was doing a lot of animation, and then Broadcast Arts. Well, did the pilot for Wayside School, which was a real shame that didn't get on there. Because that would have outdone Pee-wee in terms of the different styles of animation that were going to be incorporated into that. And I think even to this day that people are still inspired by that and trying to do interesting shows. But again, the budgets usually call for quick and down and dirty, and a lot of relying on computers to fill in. But I think that even as an artist, when people were looking at the work I was doing back then, they were saying, like, so what happens? You make this and then you press a button and it gets done. There was never that magic machine that made animation. And even computers, you still have to do. You might be able to get away with a couple of frames that the computer generates for you, but you still have to make sure those frames line up and that the animation flows properly. So it's still painstaking.
And sorry.
Oh, I was going to interject. In regards to the popularity of that clip that you just showed, I think some of it may harken back to the fact that as a performance artist, which Pee-wee is in addition to being a comedian, a stand-up comedian, part of what he did as part of his act would sometimes be to have a projection that he would perform in front of. So he would be projecting something, he's on a lunch line or he's in some other environment, and he would, as a performance artist, directly choreograph his action to have something to do with whatever that projection was. So in a way, this was like this little animated version of things that he was already doing as a performance artist in his work as a comedian. And I think maybe that is part of the appeal to the people who were familiar with what he had been doing previously could see that in something like that. And go like, oh yeah, he's doing that thing he does. And we love that about him.
And mixed media is what you do. Is this, do you agree with everyone else?
Oh, it was a huge, Saturday morning was populated by a lot of, traditional cell animation, which had been reduced to the least production value possible to crank out, big episodes of, 50 episodes of
Super Friends. Yeah.
And some of them were better written than others, but this was the first show that had a live action cast of superb talent, and it was first use of stop motion since Davy and Goliath, probably, and it had that kind of throwback to early days, but it had a little bit of irony and the visual wit from the different designers, from Gary and Wayne and all the rest of the folks. So it was a real transition in that MTV era of sort of the explosion of visual technique and design. I'm very proud of it. And it just coincidentally, that was the same year that we did all the on-air graphics for CBS, which was an amazing package of abstract expressionist swirling of colors and characters made out of geometric shapes. Saying, stay tuned, CBS Saturday morning. And at the same time, we were doing commercials for all the toys and the fast food. We're probably responsible for the obesity of America. Kraft macaroni and cheese and Wendy's kids meal. We were doing all those goofy commercials. We were also selling beer to kids. We did Bud Bowl, the Budweiser and Bud Light. We were playing football with the long neck bottles. I worked with Spuds McKenzie. Shame on us. It was terrible.
I had a question that was right there when I started thinking about
long neck beers.
I was thinking about the Spudettes that hung around with Spuds.
As cutting edge as using stop motion was in Saturday morning, the thing that stands out also with Pee-wee's Playhouse is that you have those classic cartoons, the King's cartoons.
Right.
How did that come about, and what do you think the appeal is of having those old iWorks and Fletcher cartoons in Pee-wee's Playhouse?
Well, it was funny, at the very beginning of the design of the show, there was all kinds of interest in our childhood memories of the early cartoons and the early kids shows. And for research, we actually dug up a bunch of Howdy Doody and some of the earlier shows, and we were appalled how bad they were. It was like slow and hard to watch, and bad camera, bad lighting. Like, oh my God. But they often did include cartoons as part of the format when there was a host, and we enjoyed that. And you know, the early animation, while it still had its craving for efficiency with cycles, you know, so somebody was walking or somebody was dancing, and would go on for a while. But there was still this original invention of characters and physical comedy and a little bit of political incorrectness because it was a bunch of adults doing cartoons and nobody was watching over them closely. So it fit into that double audience, showing old cartoons to kids who've never seen them because they're out of fashion, and yet they did have some edginess to them, and so the adult audience and kids both sort of embrace it. And of course, they were edited down. They weren't 7 minutes long, they were like 40 seconds long, which kept with the high energy of the show.
Early on, when Paul started getting tired of the show, in the fourth and fifth season, they become 2 and 3 minute long clips.
Did they?
Yeah, they did.
Oh,
You can read all about it.
Well, it's funny, I was just thinking that the sensibility too, it was a very downtown New York show for the first season, and then when it moved to LA, it still had a lot of the same design to it, but it kind of lost the edge. They had a much bigger set where they could move around, and you know, and we weren't involved in it. So, yeah.
I wanted to show a clip that you worked on, Tim, that I found out is a fan favorite of someone here. Go on now. Will it click? Will it click? It will. It will. Right. Make sure this is.
Come closer!
One of my favorites.
Right up to my face!
Your question? That segment, it was really funny. One, I had been working on Life in the Fridge and some stuff on Mutant Toys and some other props for some other animation. When the Aardman guys started working on, before they got to Penny, they had just finished up doing the Pee-wee in Space segment. And I got offered the chance to work with them on the next clay animated Pee-wee segment. And they came in with this storyboard, which is in here somewhere, which was that the clay part of that, where they said, well, we need a boat that turns into a fish, and a fish that turns into an airplane, and can you make all these in-between props for it? And I'm sitting there, you know, trying to turn a fish into an airplane. And it was a lot of fun to work on that, but it was really literally the first clay animation job that I had worked with them on. And they took that off and we saw the footage and it looked really, really cool. And then I worked on all this other stuff throughout the whole summer and into the fall. And then they came to me and said, we need you to make this brain that has Pee-wee's legs. And we needed like a big empty like cranium set that he could sit in. And we found this, actually it was a chair, I think that was from Igo Pogo. From the set that he could, yeah, we were always incorporating little bits that we found around the studio, so that chair was from there. And we filmed this segment of the brain getting up and like, you know, looking a bit uncomfortable. And it wasn't until I was watching the show on Saturday morning of that episode, I think that might have been the third episode, I don't know, that I realized that they put them together. And that, you know, Huey comes up to the camera and zooms into his nose, and then suddenly it's, you know, his brain. It was just so wonderful to see it, not knowing it. And it really, I don't think it was intended originally that way. It just kind of, somebody had an idea, I don't know, somewhere along the line, and it just worked so wonderfully. So I was proud to have done both segments and didn't blend it.
The mutant toys were brought up a couple times this evening. And I just want to show a brief clip, if I can get my mouse.
I love my toys. Let's see what they're doing right now.
There are a couple different clips edited together. You know what?
Nice dialogue.
One thing that stands out for me, you can clap for it, sure. One thing that stands out to me as I see this is some of the mutant toys remind me of Toy Story. Remind me of the mutant toys that the kid in Toy Story, the bad kid.
I have the Misfit toys.
And that too. And also, I saw on YouTube, someone kind of put up a screenshot of Roger, the puppet, the giant green eye, for those of you that are familiar, looking a lot like the Monsters, Inc. Character. And I'm just curious, having worked on this and being familiar with these stop-motion characters, do you see a lot of Pee-wee's Playhouse influence in things that are still on television today or things that have been on television since?
Well, there was that science show that...
Beachman's World.
Yeah, that was...
Wayne worked on that too.
It was very much Pee-wee format. I mean, when the mixed media thing, and including animation and that sort of became more sort of embraced, there was a lot of shows in my mind. I mean, things as popular as Alf, puppets in live action, all kinds of variations.
I find that there's often, a lot of times, it's not conscious, like no one's looking to copy the giant eye guy from Pee-wee and make it into the eye guy from Monsters, Inc. I mean, Monsters, Inc. had so many monsters in it that there was always going to be some comparison to other ones that came before it. And I've got sketchbooks full of designs for monsters that are, could have been on that are on this, like films like that, because when kids draw monsters, they draw monsters that are hairy. I think there's a lot of just, creative people who don't even realize where their inspiration comes from, and, I don't think it's necessarily copying, but I think that there was just so much going on in Pee-wee and so many different artists that got to contribute to that I think that there's no way to not influence everybody afterwards. And I think that, a lot of the artists who worked on it have gone on to do lots of other interesting, fun. I have had, a blast, and got to do so many fun things since. But I think it's just, I don't see anyone, just knocking off.
Fair.
And to others in the industry and other things that you've worked on, Rob, maybe you can field this one. How important is the fact that you worked on Pee-wee's Playhouse in terms of getting other jobs, or is it kind of an important point on your resume in terms of impressing other people that you work with?
It was certainly a major stepping stone. Because that was a hotbed of all the best talent in New York City at the time. Not just animation, but artists in general. So to be in that environment at that moment in time was a real pivotal moment in New York art history, I think, in many ways. In terms of how it affected my future, of course, it led to other jobs. In terms of a resume, I don't know if it really was, so much bigger than many other things, but I'll tell you, as a teacher nowadays, that's the thing that my students are most impressed with. I said, "You worked on Pee-wee's Playhouse?" Oh my God. That they love more than any of the maybe other things that could be considered in some ways maybe bigger credits, perhaps, for some reason. So it's had an influence on my life in a lot of ways. And there was a whole bunch of people that were part of that community of artists that were working on it that remained friends for years and years afterwards. Two people right here, for instance, but many others. It was a huge influence on each of our lives.
It was a big growth spurt for having started a studio, and it led to lots of other pilots and other projects with Disney and Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network. We did Codename Kids Next Door, worked with Mo Willems on Sheep in the Big City. Recently we've done some preschool shows like the Little Einsteins, and we're currently working on Umi Zumi for Nick Jr. Influencing commercials. A lot of people point to things from Pee-wee and say that, let's do something funny like that. And it's been part of a trajectory for mixed media animation as opposed to realistic special effects, which is not something that I've been associated with, but embracing sort of the artist influence, design, aesthetic, and the mixed media thing. Mixed media is sort of a confusing term, whether it comes from the fine arts world or whether it means collage or whatever. But in my niche, the word mixed media means that you embrace all of the different possible techniques and you really sort of use your judgment to pick what gets done in what way and how it comes together, and how you preserve certain things that are raw and how you have the ability to polish certain other things, and the whole issue of timing and pacing, and it's exciting. It's still something that, and to see the industry expand. Now all of the schools have pretty extensive animation departments that are not purely digital. They still embrace the different tributaries of visual image making, and now it's a big industry, and there's a place for people to make careers in video games, on the internet, cable, and traditional entertainment shows. Commercials are getting weirder and weirder in certain regards, which is great.
My last question, and then I'll open it up to our visitors. The week before Pee-wee's Playhouse debut, Judy Price, who was the executive who was in charge of CBS children's television, was commenting on something that came up earlier in terms of Saturday morning television kind of being a wasteland in terms of just animation to sell toys, basically. And what she said in the New York Times was, we've got to reverse that image that exists, the Saturday morning ghetto. That's what's important to us, that we can somehow make a distinction. And if we can do that with Pee-wee's Playhouse, we can change attitudes and children's television. Do you believe that you were successful in doing that?
At the point, it was very exciting, and I think it was a tipping point for the explosion of what Nickelodeon did, and then Disney had to compete with that, and then the emergence of Cartoon Network and things like their more experimental late night stuff with liquid television and all the rest. So yeah, I mean, the quality is uneven here and there, but kids programming is very much more eclectic and interesting and character-driven with different design influences. And while it's not all attributed to Pee-wee, I think Pee-wee was like a tipping point for branching out into a lot of different styles. And you know, it's still got to be funny and entertaining, but there's a lot more tools in the kit.
Yeah, I think that it's funny that it was the last great thing on Saturday morning television that led to, as you said, Nickelodeon having, you know, Ren and Stimpy and Doug, and then having 20. Now we have 5 or 6 networks of 24 hours a day animated shows, whether it's classic or whether it's new stuff. And now Saturday morning is not there anymore. It's not that special time for kids to get up and watch cartoons. It's day shows they can go to on NBC, and what's on the networks is nothing compared to what's on cable. So in one way, it led to all that, but in another way, you know, it makes it not having that, you know, your big balls here and outside. Not quite as special.
Okay. Does someone want to?
You can pass the mic around for questions.
Pass that down.
Questions? Anybody have any questions? Okay, well.
I wondered if, is this working, doing anything?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, I wonder if you could talk about the New York versus LA situation, like you mentioned that the show eventually moved to LA, and did Paul Rubens have to fight hard to have it in New York, where executives don't have as much control?
Actually, on the contrary, we were in New York, so we proposed that it be a New York show. Paul wasn't that excited about it because LA was his home, and being a visitor in New York was sort of a strain, and it was Paul who wanted to take the second season back to LA, and there was also a business strain between my studio and Paul and the CBS. So there was a parting of ways, and it sort of naturally followed Paul home. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.